here's a way for people to have a voice. You have your basically a simple transmitter, mixer, microphone, CD player, power supply, antenna, whatever. It's a very simple process, and this is the means by which people can communicate in their communities. They can speak truth to power, and they can seize back what has been stolen from them, the airwaves.
Good.
Anyone of appropriate medical knowledge. But to say that this is the only avenue, I don't buy it.
Okay. Do
I
you know
simply
it?
don't. I also think it sends a very bad message to our children, and I can tell you.
What sends a bad message? Which is worse message to send to the children? Let's let our parents suffer and die sooner, or let them have the pain relief they need?
No, the message that's being sent is that there is nothing wrong with marijuana, that it's good for you, that the kids are now saying, oh, it cures cancer. So they're getting a message. And
nobody has said
it
it's
just
cured.
opens the door for, gosh, we knew we couldn't trust the old folks anyway. They want to keep all the good stuff for themselves.
What happened to the 70 million of us if they took 100 million of us from home? And I know people always going to say, when are y'all going to give that a rest? And every time you watch Fury or Flicker, and you watch the horse look over the corral gate at the open pastures and remember the days it used to run free, you cry crocodile tears. But when an African say we long to be home, you talk this stupid stuff about, why don't y'all give that up? Well, see, what's going to change is our assessment of what we think about our home, right? Mm-hmm. And once we change, then it don't matter what other people say. And this is what we're in the process of doing. We get together like this every night to kind of like do ourselves this kind of therapy thing.
We make it our business of providing you with information. Information that's unfiltered. For example, this short tidbit of information. Did you know that there's a class action lawsuit against the city of New York by 63,000 citizens who were illegally strip searched during 96 and 97?
Nah, you got it all wrong. It's deeper objective understanding that leads to the alien developmental techniques of the sacred transpersonal transformation. And you've got to have spiritual bioenergetic process or you can't have holistic ongoing channeling. Don't you understand?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have an intense subjective understanding of the Eastern experiential process and just let yourself feel the alternative synchronic relationship between the spiritual meditative integration.
Now that makes a little bit of sense to me, but you're forgetting about the vibrant developmental continuum of sacred transpersonal transformation of the empowering interactive awareness.
The fact of the matter is the airways belong to the people. They belong to us. They've been usurped by the FCC and have been basically given to the corporations to make an immense amount of profit from, and at great detriment to essentially the common good. And to me, the situation is pretty unequivocal. We have to have the airways back for our communities to be able to communicate, to establish our own voices, to do what we think should be done with the airwaves at a community level. And if the FCC wants to stand in the way of that, fine.
1934, the FCC was created to regulate the airwaves in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. But over time, the corporations and the private interests have gained control of the airwaves to a point now where the mere prospect of using a tiny little sliver of the airwaves for public interest, convenience, and necessity is met with federal marshals who come storming in and shut you down, as has been the case in the past couple of years. 400 stations have been shut down for using the airwaves for free speech.
In the last 2 years, there has been something in the neighborhood of 525 stations that have closed down. Over 400 of those have been on a voluntary basis. So we will sometimes pay visits 2 or 3 times to people. We are not looking to go to court. That's a last resort. We are not looking for seizures. That is a last resort. It's only when people are intransigent.
The FCC came by once and wanted to look at the transmitter, and I denied them access. And they said, well, you're breaking another law, not letting us in. I said, no, that's only if I had a license. What's your name? Well, I'm Skidmark Bob. And he got his clipboard out, and, they had phones holstered, I guess that's what they think their guns are, but they had little phones. David Doon and Richard Harthorne, I think, was the two agents. And they couldn't find the address because the house was just a chaotic house. It was on Campbell Street, a house that ended up getting plowed down.
Well, our engineer has taken our transmitter and submerged it. It's in a pressure pot that's filled with oil, so that
Waterproof?
That's waterproof. It's like watertight sealed. The cords are coming out of top of the pressure pot, and it's basically so that we can bury it underground and not have to worry about the heat, about our transmitter overheating, because we can't put a fan on it, which is usually we're in Texas and it's real hot. So it's underground, submerged in oil, so the heat from the transmitter will distribute into the oil and be released through the ground. And we put some steel rebar through there, laid some concrete on top, so that if the FCC wants our transmitter, they're going to have to work for it.
What is the FCC so worried about us about? We got a pretty positive message, and they're allowing some really crazy. You give them a couple of bucks and you can say anything. I mean,
The more of these micro stations, these community stations that can start up, the better. And we need to also fight for legislation that allows them to operate without the other stations coming down on them, or the FCC.
Yeah, they're considering that now. They put forward an LPFM proposal.
Right, that's right.
People are kind of cynical about what's going to happen.
Well, that's okay. Those people should stay cynical because they keep everybody else honest. Yeah.
A lot of the people who have been fighting for LPFM now are worried that with government regulation they won't be able to say what they want to say.
And then a whole new system of pirate radio will start up to fight the LPFM.
Do you think it's necessary with the changes, the big buyouts in government and the Telecommunications Act? Do you think it's a necessary alternative voice?
Well, we're at a point now where we don't have any voice. 5 corporations essentially own most of the media in this country. So, hang on one second here, okay?
No democracy can really thrive in a fundamental, deep sense if it has to rely so heavily on the commercial mass media. And so there arises over the golden horizon what is called community media, nonprofit media, media that deals with news as worthy of the attention of dignified human beings, media that does not trivialize, does not sensationalize, does not aim for the lowest impulses of its desired audience, a media that engages discussion and debate, a media that does not place commercial values over news values, over the values of people's right to know and right to discuss and right to voice.
David and Goliath lets David win in the Bible, but in the free market, Goliath wins.
What is the whole thrust of the radio thing? It's about advertising. It's about selling stuff. Why in the world would, it's kind of clear that if you poor, you can't buy all that stuff on there, so they ain't talking to you anyway.
E-Loan is an equal housing lender and not currently licensed in
Folks rely on their Chevrolet cars to go the distance. And every day, hard-working Americans.
Call 1-800-CELLULAR for the one that works, Cellular One.
And really works well. I'm Tom Shane, and our selection of single wedding.
Right now, I'm standing at the gorgeous new Clinique counter. Excuse me, miss,
San
can you give me a
Mateo,
little
northbound
tour?
101, past 3rd Avenue. Please get 25% off the entire stock of jockey underwear for men, including all briefs, boxers, tees, sport, and fashion styles now through September 6th.
Back to school sale going on now at Mervin's.
Syndicated, uniform national broadcasting is much more profitable for the big stations. And so we lose in terms of civic vitality as well as fairness. Because after all, the public owns the airwaves, although you wouldn't know that by listening to the broadcasters. They actually own by law the airwaves, and the FCC has the responsibility for allocating with that in mind. But I think the FCC has forgotten it in the last 30, 40 years.
Well, a lot of us, like when we started the station, I was homeless. So I was on the street all the time. I was seeing this shit go down all the time. So I said, well, I might as well have a tape recorder, and we have a little power now. Because we have this transmitter, we could take it there and play, this person getting arrested by this cop and get the cop's name and talk about him on the air. And before that, people just didn't have access to that. You know, it's like you go to KUSP or you go to KZSC, one of the local public stations, they just laugh at you. We're not going to play that on the air. And so we have our own show, and we'll play that. Robert Norris, Bathurst Fears Broadsides, he plays a lot of interviews with homeless people that he gets that are never aired because everybody's afraid of homeless people. And so we put it on the air, and people hear about that culture and hear about how, you know, how things are.
Welcome to Fox In Depth. I'm David Asman. There's a war raging all around us, but you can't see it. The reason you can't see it is because the battleground is on invisible airwaves. The issue? Who has the right to broadcast radio signals over those airwaves? For more on
the newest Twin Cities radio station is the buzz of the broadcast world. It's slick, it's happening, and it's illegal.
They're radio rebels at war with the FCC.
Broadcast a variety of funk, hip-hop, reggae, and rap music, but because the amateur station isn't licensed yet, listeners may also be getting an earful of profanity.
The FCC estimates there are hundreds of unlicensed pirate radio stations operating illegally across America. When it finds them, it shuts them down.
Well, the Commission's policy is really quite simple. You must obtain a license before you can broadcast.
What do you think about this?
You found the beat of Minneapolis.
Good dance music. Definitely.
Good beat.
And the law is knocking at the door.
The pirate station is living by none of these rules.
97.7 on the dial is an unlicensed station, a so-called micro-broadcaster transmitting secretly somewhere from a downtown Minneapolis apartment high-rise.
If we allow anyone that can go out and build a transmitter or buy a transmitter to use the airwaves, there's going to be chaos, utter chaos.
When radio came on, everybody said, aha, it's going to be the voice of the people. It's going to be decentralized. It's going to be nonprofit. It's going to be what Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover in 1920 said will be forever a public trust and never commercialized with the contamination of advertisements. Can you imagine? And that struggle went on for a few years between the educational radio organizations and the commercial radio organizations, and the commercial radio organizations ended up winning.
I mean, the mainstream media is controlled by just a few corporations, so all the information that goes out is basically what those corporations want us to hear, and we're giving the alternative view, like what we're seeing in the real news, like what the stuff, nothing's covered, nothing at all these days. There's a lot going on.
It's been totally homogenized to serve certain market groups of people.
At this point in time, the group that owns most of the radio stations is the private sector. Huge corporations own and control the airwaves. And the point of the micro radio movement is to try and go into those small spaces where the airwaves aren't being controlled by the corporate sector and open them up for community use.
We're opposed to it mainly because of the interference that we think this is going to create and cause to existing broadcasters. Anyone who listens to radio understands that interference is a big problem, and we think that the LPFM proposal is likely to cause significant interference to existing stations.
Here's a station that we can do anything we please. We can have people pioneering in music. We can have people discussing local issues. We can have people discussing world issues in a manner that any kind of sponsored radio cannot do. And thanks to the web, we can take this little station and talk to the whole world eventually.
Radio is the bomb.
Chuck has been an inspiration for a lot of the mini FM transmitters for a long time. And his case was definitely seen as one of the original sort of litmus test cases in terms of fighting for mini FM radio as a free speech issue.
Black Liberation Radio, again, was another source of inspiration for what we decided to do. That was begun probably around 1988 by Mbana Kantako, who started Black Liberation Radio out of a housing project called the John Hay Housing Project in Springfield, Illinois. Essentially, the housing project was, we could consider it basically to be an urban Bantustan. In other words, this is basically where pretty much most people of color have been isolated in that community, largely due to class and race differences. And they were subject to all kinds of abuse from the police and other agencies.
Oh yeah, once again, it's that time of the day where the station gets truly funky. But right about now, I've got something special for ya. As I speak, this radio station is taking over the airwaves. Follow for now, and do not attempt to change the channel.
Zelango, this is Kanadi Kantako, back with another edition of Notes on the Devil's News for our 3,889th night of broadcasting. I'll be dropping the headlines while Mbana gives you the stories. He'll be breaking them down for the way to help you see through the devil's tricks and lies. Remember, Notes on the Devil's News is a Human Rights Radio exclusive presentation, meaning you can hear Notes on the Devil's News here at Human Rights Radio.
That is right, and indeed, we's in our 3,889th night of broadcasting, and welcome to another edition of Notes on the Devil's News. There are a couple things you got to remember when you listen to Notes on the Devil's News. Number one, we do not call this garbage news. And number two, we do not call this garbage that these devils do be calling news. True. But what we will do is add truth to it. Hopefully you is going to see it for what it is. Every day we at least do a 90-minute program we call Notes on the Devil's News. That's where we go over. What I use it to do is to reinforce what Malcolm's taught about, you know, analyzing things. Mm-hmm. We'll take the stories that, say, the mainstream press call the news, and we critique them with an intent of showing people how to critique, and that we better learn how to critique and stop waiting for Dan Rather to give us our opinion, right?
Well, the Hay Homes was a public housing project that no longer exists. It's been bulldozed. But in those days, when the radio station started, there was a group at the Hay Homes called the John Hay Tenants' Rights Association. And this was a group that was doing organizing around tenants' rights issues. And one of the problems that any group doing community organizing, or in this case tenant organizing, is bound to run into is how you do outreach, how you get in touch with people, get them activated, get them aware of the issues, and so on. And so there were a number of ideas that were floated about, you know, how to do that. I mean, obviously ringing doorbells is one way, having a chat with somebody directly. But there were other ways that people, you know, might be reached also. And so aside from a newspaper format, which had been tried, one day people were just sitting around and brainstorming what could be done, and the idea came up of doing radio. It was almost like sort of laughingly mentioned as, well, why don't we have our own radio station?
People would start coming by the apartments and, you don't really have a radio station in here, do you? You know, they'd have to actually come in and you know, if you see this stuff, it doesn't take up much room, and it's really hard to believe. I know when we got the transmitter, it looked like an oversized cigar box. You know, we were expecting this big crate, you know, to come in. We'd have to pry off the wood casing and, you know, haul this thing out. And, you know, this thing comes in a box, and it's like this. And this is a transmitter?
Yeah. We came on the air November 25th, 1986, and went relatively unknown until March 1989. In March of 1989, a series of police brutality cases came to our attention here at the station, and we attempted to cover them. In the final case, we call it the Gregory Court Massacre, where 3 of our people were killed by a death squad of police, masked men with weapons, automatic rifles, flak jackets, jumpsuits, dressed for a war. We covered that story, and that's when the chief of police at the time filed a complaint with the FCC. He claimed that some people had called him and told him that we was cussing on the radio.
The radio station did do on-the-spot coverage of police situations that were either violent or potentially violent. And there was a siege laid to one particular person's house that ended in bloodshed, and Mbana was right there on the spot giving, you know, people directly information about what was going on. The police, of course, did not like that at all.
That's who was really giving us the hard time when we started the station, was the police. You know, they was, at one point they got to it where they just straight out killed somebody. They said, okay, y'all don't think we serious, do y'all? Whomp, they just beat the blood out of a man, you know. So the station grew out of our effort to find a way to resolve these kind of problems, you know.
I would say that the major accomplishment from that early period was, and I attribute this really almost solely to Banner's efforts with the radio station, was the great decline in overt police brutality against blacks in this community. It was not unusual to have blacks beat up, occasional deaths at the hands of the police and this kind of thing. But if you listen to some of the tapes that he did with victims of police brutality, I mean, they're just chilling accounts.
Like he putting his hands on, like, you know, putting his hands on. My uncle said, don't put your hands on him. He said, you got to put your hands on him. And so he grabbed his handcuff out of the back of them and slammed the door on their face and charged over there by me and grabbed me. So I balled up. And so I, you know, because I didn't know, I balled up. So I said, the nurse asked you, could you leave the handcuff off me, you know, until I get through with the x-ray and fill out right there. And so he reached back and hit me 2 times. Hit me with the handcuffs on my left side of my face, hit me with his fist on my right.
He hit you. You said your cousin opened the door?
He opened the door. When he opened the door, he seen Bridges on my back.
Mm-hmm. Bridges was on you?
On my back,
On the bed with you?
No, on the floor.
Oh, he had not. How did you get on the floor?
Knocked me when he hit me.
Oh, it knocked you on the floor?
Yeah.
And then he jumped down there on you?
Yeah, he was down there on me.
Doing what?
Hitting me.
He wasn't trying to put no handcuffs on you?
No, I don't know what he was trying to do, and I was balled up. And then next thing you know, my cousin opened the door and looked in, and all those people inside the hallway. When I opened the door, all those people was inside the hallway, looking inside and see what's happening. And my blood was coming from the side of my face, coming down from the side of my face.
What did Bridges do when he saw people looking?
He was shocked, because it was like he was caught into something that he knew he had no business doing.
When the nurse came back, what did the nurse say?
She didn't say one word. She seen the blood coming down from the side of her face.
There was no blood before she left the room?
Sure wasn't. It wasn't nothing but that right there, gash in the upper tear, that gash that I supposed to be treated for up at the top part of my eyebrow. That I supposed to got treated for, and then when she came back, it was another gash at the side of my face in my temple.
How was Bridges when the nurse came back?
How was he?
Yeah.
He was just standing there.
He just standing there?
Mm-hmm, standing at the door. He didn't say nothing. And when he shut the door back again, he said, I loved it.
Oh, was the nurse in the room when he came
back? He said, I loved it. I thought you loved it, huh? He said, yeah, I love busting your head.
Springfield being the capital of Illinois, the home of Abraham Lincoln, they just couldn't have this stuff going out over the air, you know. And they had plans, even in the works back at that time, to build a multi-million-dollar, no, probably going to be $100 million before it's done, presidential library. They just couldn't have police being exposed, killing and beating up blacks in Lincoln's home. It was just as simple as that. And so now they beat up whites. I mean, poor whites. I swear to God, if you look back over the recent cases of police brutality in Springfield, it's poor white guys that are getting pushed around. It doesn't happen too much to blacks anymore. So, I mean, and that to us demonstrated the power of micro radio. I mean, he had like, I don't know, 5 watts or something of power at that time. And the fact that you could make, you know, such a major impact on the community in a very, very important area convinced us that, you know, this was the way to go.
Because the 5-0 is on your block with their little whirling lights out there, and they'll come in your house and they'll whoop the living hell out you, and nobody you know will say a word. Man, I'm telling you, man. Y'all ever heard of this group out of the criminal enterprise called San Francisco called Food Not Bombs? I got some tapes. I did some interviews with them, man. This is a group of white dudes, you know, the liberal types. They go out and do shit like give away food. And the police be kicking their ass, man, don't they? They do. They be locking them up. They come out and they beat them. No giving away food. This is why you are afraid to deal with human rights. Because if they get on you about giving away food, you know why they're against giving away food, don't you? Somebody might not bow down at work because they got a plate coming anyway, right? So you bow down at work because without that, you can't feed yourself, see? And they know that, see? These fools don't have no respect for your human rights. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to be about the business of educating yourself to the point where you respect yourself. See, with their education, you have no respect for yourself, right?
Right.
I mean, and that's why you don't trip on human rights. People say, I think that's radical. No, I think you're a coward. That's what I think. What we're able to do, we combine the knowledge of the elders with the kind of funky beat that everybody kind of like, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, oh man, we got kids. You'll see tonight, got a group of 6 to 12-year-old brothers. They're going to sit down at 6 o'clock and start writing, and they won't care if they don't stop until 8. Now this is after being at school all day.
Yeah.
Well, why is that? Because this is something that's relevant to them. This is something that means something to them. This is something that's going to, you know, help them in their own development. So yeah.
Umbanda was able to, you know, once the Hay homes started getting boarded up as people left, and it became clear that eventually it would be demolished, those boarded up houses that were no longer being occupied were used by Umbanda for his various programs that he has with youth that today happen elsewhere because the Hay homes are no longer there. But he saw the waste of all this space, and he would have a library, like he had the Marcus Garvey Library, or actually it was the Malcolm X Library, and he had various, you know, programs for young people, and he has a presence in the community to this day based on that, where people realize that he, you know, he's not just somebody on the radio, but that he's actively involved in working with the kids in the neighborhood and you know, being a voice for the voiceless in general on the radio, and beyond the radio, being somebody who has taken an active interest in making that community strong. And
we started this program working with children in '84 when Michael and I met. They're learning the most important thing, that is who they are. And nobody can live without that knowledge. Marcus Garvey said a people without knowledge of themselves is like a tree without roots. We'll have peace and harmony among us. We'll have peace and harmony among us. We'll be loving. We'll be loving. Sharing. And creating. We will work. Study. And listen. So we may learn. Learn so we may teach.
At the present time, you know, they're fronting this idea of, you know, low power radio and so on, and contending that they're not opposed to, you know, low power radio, and at the same time they're going after people all over the country. If they go after Umbanda, I think he represents, since he's in some ways the founder of the movement, many people acknowledge him as that within the movement. He represents more than just one station, one isolated individual. He has community roots, and he has an important connection nationally to the movement as a whole.
We already got, you know, if they do come and take this transmitter, we got another one already in town that's ready to go as soon as they leave out the door, so we ain't even worried about it. That's not an issue. How many times?
Go back on the air?
Oh, sure. We're going to stay on it. So they have to, you know, when they come, if they come at this one, what they need to plan on is what they're going to do about the second one. And the third one, okay? It's like by any means necessary kind of thing, you know what I mean?
You worried about fines?
Ain't got no money. If I had some money, I might, but I ain't got no money, okay? No, I ain't worried about them and their fines. I ain't worried about nothing they got.
So my argument is very simple. The present media is too large and wasteful. From now on, we should think about the smaller media to diverse our culture and community.
Tetsuo Kagawa is an activist and an intellectual who lives in Japan. And he was in Europe in the 70s at a time when pirate radio was sort of a major phenomenon there. The anarchist groups and activist groups were getting involved in setting up pirate radio stations in Italy and France, and he was sort of got turned on by that idea while he was living there. And then when he went to Japan, he started a very powerful mini FM movement, primarily in Tokyo, that at one point grew to, I believe, more than 3,000 mini FM stations in Tokyo.
Students of mine started a radio station using this kind of technique in university campus. And they had a good audience in Tokyo. And in a year, over 1,000 of stations appeared very quickly.
Well, part of the reason this project came to be, we drew inspiration from different people, and one of those was Tetsuo, who conceived of essentially neighborhood radio stations in Japan, places that were small enough that you could essentially bicycle to have a little neighborhood radio station, which pretty well fit with my concept of what we were doing, perhaps on a little bit larger scale.
The technology of mini media is easy to control, so that we can be independent from the expert authorities and special institutions.
I met him here and spoke with him about building mini FM transmitters, and I thought that was a really interesting idea. So I invited him to come to a special meeting at my house. I invited a bunch of other people to come, and he came and we had dinner together, and he built up a transmitter in front of us as we sort of sat around the room and speaking about the politics of radio. And we built up a mini FM transmitter right there, and we went live, and we were sort of probably one of the first mini FM transmitters operating, at least in the Bay Area.
This plug is connected to the monitor jack here. Hello? Hello?
And the idea was that people could build these, at least to get a hands-on experience. In other words, the whole concept was to kind of empower people with the idea that they could make their own transmitters, which was a viable concept, and that's one we've continued to this day.
Well, Stephen Dunifer is a key figure in the whole movement. Free Radio Berkeley, was a very significant, player in the whole movement. He helped organize conferences that were micropower radio conferences. He also, was involved in getting transmitters to people, not only here, but internationally. And he's been very much concerned with, seeing the growth of this movement happen. And so he's played a very significant role.
When I read the East Bay Express article about Stephen in 1993 and heard about what this guy was doing in Berkeley, I realized immediately, that's what I want to do too.
In 1990, we were contacted by Mike Townsend concerning Mbana Kintako, and we were informed about what he was doing on the air using low-power radio in Illinois. So one of the first things we did, and this is when I got involved with the committee, was to prepare a proposed legal brief that Mbana could use in the event that he decided to pursue legal action. At that point, I think he'd been fined a certain amount of money. At that point, actually, they were fining him in the realm of like $100 or $500. I forget now. Not like the $10,000, $20,000 fines that are now regularly being issued. And Mbana was going to challenge it. So what I was involved in was preparing a legal brief. It came to about 120 pages that he could use in the event he chose to challenge the fine. At some point, he declined to use to go in affirmatively, and do a legal challenge. So at that point, the Lawyers Guild, we had this 110, 120-page brief, and we were looking for other micro-broadcasters that we could represent. At a presentation that was given at the New College, I recall Stephen Dunifer was there, and he later contacted us and told us about his wanting to go on the air to protest the coverage of the Gulf War. And at that point, we hooked up with him and began to prepare a legal challenge using a lot of the research that was initially done for Mbana Kintako in Springfield.
And they were doing it on a neighborhood range basis, very low power. It began in Berkeley, California, right here, on a hill, right near my house. And the man put some stuff in a van he put together and get up on the hill, and he broadcast every night on what was going on in the black community and in City Hall and so forth. And did it for a while, and then the government, and then it turned out to be a movement. There were at least 200 pirate stations in the country, and some people have said more, maybe twice as many, because it's so easy to do and there was such a need for it. So they arrested this man, and the fine is $10,000 or 10 years in prison, not a small thing, and closed him down. But it was uncontrollable. Since it was illegal, but they even had a conference, a national conference in San Jose, California, and there were 400 pirate broadcasters who showed up. And since it was uncontrollable, it was clear that they couldn't stop it.
Yes, and good evening once again. This is Free Radio Berkeley, on the air and on time, amazing folks. What you're listening to right now is the Mexican revolutionary music from the 1930s in the ranchera style. We've got some very good programs for you this evening. Some more information on what's happening in Chiapas. And we have the Rad Man back with us tonight, and some good music and all kinds of good information. So stay tuned. This is Free Radio Berkeley, 88.1 on your FM receiver. And back to the music. Essentially, this project has been going now since 1992. Free Radio Berkeley itself went on the air on April 11th of 1993. Essentially, the goal and purpose of this was to, one, establish it as a free speech voice, as a First Amendment activity, to challenge the FCC's regulatory policies that essentially prohibited this type of operation from occurring, and essentially provide a voice for the community. And that's always been the reasons for this project, and pretty much the reasons for the whole movement, really, to unequivocally claim our First Amendment rights, to challenge the status quo, and be a voice for the voiceless. And that's really, I would say, the underlying operating principles of this movement, essentially.
NPR claims to do all of those things. Do you think that they've succeeded or failed in their mission in that regard?
They fail. They failed miserably. I mean, they're a voice for Archer Daniel Midlands, not for the people. I mean, people have to differentiate between quote-unquote access, if there's any at all, and having a voice. There's a vast difference between just merely having access and having a voice. Micro radio, low power FM, free radio gives people a voice in their own communities because it gives them their own station by which to speak to one another and share their ideas, their news, their cultures.
You see where National Public Radio, there's just an analysis done on who is actually on their news shows, who they are relying on to provide information, and the overwhelming majority of sources quoted on NPR are corporate or government bureaucrats or paid political consultants. You don't have representatives of labor unions, you don't have representatives of consumer or environmental organizations, and you sure don't have any regular people.
So in any event, Stephen had his attorney Luke Heiken respond to the FCC, and he sent a very well-reasoned 10, 12-page letter based on a lot of the arguments that we had put together in the Mbana brief. And he continued to broadcast, and the FCC never responded. They never really issued a response to the legal arguments that Stephen presented about why the prohibition on low-power FM was unconstitutional, how it was a violation of international law due to the various covenants that the U.S. has adopted. The FCC got tired of waiting for itself, and then it finally got its lawyers to go into federal court, try to get a preliminary injunction to shut down Free Radio Berkeley. At the hearing, in front of Judge Claudia Wilken, the FCC had adopted this very cocky attitude. At one point, their attorney was saying, "Your Honor, we've been shutting down these stations since before you were born," and the judge didn't like that sort of condescending attitude. In fact, I recall the attorney for the FCC brought his son to, watch him, get another victory. on behalf of shutting down the pirates. And it became sort of apparent very early that Judge Wilkin took a lot of the constitutional arguments that we raised very seriously. And the judge said, look, Stephen Dunifer has raised quite a few constitutional issues that you haven't even addressed. You've waited 9 months, 10 months, and it's just sitting there at the FCC. What I need is some guidance from the FCC as to how do you respond to these constitutional arguments. So I'm not going to issue this injunction. I want you to go ahead and respond to the 10-page letter that Lou Peiken had prepared. So that was the first time in history of the United States that an unlicensed station remained on the air, and even though the FCC tried to shut it down. And that was kind of this real precedent-setting thing. It created a lot of gray area where a lot of people thought, well, is it legal? Is it, maybe it's legal. He's still on the air. And I think in that confusion, a lot of people just kind of jumped at the chance to get on the air.
January of 1995, the FCC attempted to get a federal injunction against Stephen Dunifer and Free Radio Berkeley. At that time, their motion was turned down by Judge Claudia Wilkin, 9th District Federal Court. She said she saw it as an issue of free speech and she wasn't going to grant them an injunction. Those of us in Free Radio Berkeley were very excited by this decision, and shortly thereafter, February 5th of 1995, we turned on our transmitter nonstop.
Yeah, so in this gray area, in this breach, all these micro radio broadcasters jumped on the air, which created a real enforcement problem for the FCC. I mean, a judge hadn't yet ruled it was constitutional to prohibit this low power FM stuff. The judge was waiting for them to respond to Dunifer's thing. And it took the FCC like another 9 or 10 months to even respond to the issues raised by Stephen. And even then, they just sort of said, look, we've looked at this before, we're never going to look at this prohibition on low power FM again. It's just, we believe that it's constitutional. They didn't really address this stuff. And in fact, the arguments about diversity on the airways that Stephen raised, they said, well, there's plenty of diversity on the airways. And anyway, it's up to us to decide whether or not there is, and we've decided that there is. Some sort of convoluted circular logic.
We're going to go in and check it out and see what scary strangeness awaits us inside. And we'll come back with a full report in a minute.
I guess so, number one.
Micropower Broadcasting is providing a valuable
What do you have to say, sir?
service in cities across the United States. It's clear that the NAB has acted irresponsibly in trying to bash micropower broadcasters.
Do you really feel the NAB has acted irresponsibly, sir?
Broadcasting is none other than a love of their community.
Yeah.
What do you want me to say here?
Oh, I wanted to say whatever might be in your mind. How do you feel about the whole concept of micropower, so-called unlicensed broadcasting?
Okay, I'm Frank from Vegas. It's a great town here. You guys have a good time. I wish you luck. God bless you, and take care. Thanks.
Okay, nothing to say about the whole issue of micro radio and the way so many more and more stations go in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Oh, yeah, the radio is a very good way to broadcast things across the nation. I think it's good. You guys keep it up, and you guys have a good time. Thank you.
Okay, just have a good one now. Stay busy.
Who's in
charge of your group?
Definitely not me.
The duly appointed representative of the owner of this property, I hereby warn you that you are trespassing upon this property. As defined by Nevada Revised Statute 207.200. If you do not leave the premises immediately, you'll be subject to arrest for a misdemeanor. If you do not leave these premises immediately, you'll be duly warned, subject to arrest, or subject to immediate arrest.
They have the right under the Nevada law to trespass us, that is, to cite us and to arrest us. So, if you are asking me for my advice would be that we move to a new spot
and we continue to demonstrate, and we continue to express them.
They wait to get the spot for us and told us to wait until they came back. Go home.
So what was that all about?
He's from Germany.
He's with the NABs from Germany?
Yeah, the people are from all over the world, man. It's like...
Oh, it's the National Association of Broadcasters. Maybe it's not the WAB.
There's 20,000, there were 20,000 people registered from outside the country.
Community-based radio, micropower broadcasting rights now. Media monopolies are dangerous. Media monopolies are un-American. Community-based radio has got the foundations of freedom. We need it. If we're going to stay a free country, we need community-based radio.
Denying this type of voice to everyone in this country is the National Association of Broadcasters, representing the corporate media oligarchy that wishes to have it all for themselves. That is, they have stolen the airwaves, which are a people's resource for everyone in this country.
Joining us now in our San Francisco bureau is pirate radio station operator for Radio Free Berkeley, Stephen Dunifer. Mr. Dunifer recently won a victory against the FCC when a federal judge refused an injunction by the commission to shut down his pirate radio station. And in Boston, we're joined by the Vice President for the Talk America Radio Network, Tom Starr. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Stephen Dunifer, let me go to you first. Why is it so important to operate your station in defiance of the FCC?
It's important because it's a First Amendment issue that we're fighting here. The FCC has created such high barriers of entry that only the rich and well-endowed can have a voice in this country now. And what we're seeking to do is establish some alternative to that would allow every community to have its own voice through inexpensive, low-cost, low-power FM stations that can easily be put together and can meet all the basic technical requirements mandated by the FCC. We're just basically seeking a more level playing field so that the average person and the community can have access to what is theirs, the airwaves.
Now, Tom Starr, what's wrong with what Mr. Dunifer is doing?
Well, first of all, I dispute that what's going on in the country is that you cannot buy a radio station if you're not part of the rich and famous, because I know many radio station owners that have radio stations and don't have a lot of money. We're able to go to a bank and borrow the money and be able to put on a facility, not maybe as elaborate as some of the other major radio stations, but more importantly, what we have to be concerned about is who's going to take care of making sure that signals don't get blocked by those radio stations that are legal. And I think also we have to make sure that we don't have radio stations being taken over by people who are going to hurt us as free Americans. And I think that is a very important issue.
Wait a minute. Excuse me, Mr. Starr. How can free speech hurt us as Americans, free speech on the airwaves?
Well, one problem that I can foresee at this moment is that if you have one radio station, you can have hundreds of radio stations all across the country. And if you want to, you could provide the same programming from one location and do it by satellite. You could, if you wanted to, you could start a riot. You could even start what the Sandinistas did in Nicaragua.
Explain what you mean, what the Sandinistas did in Nicaragua. Again, the airwaves, how are they in defiance of our First Amendment rights?
Because if you have a license and you're able to do the work that you portray that you're going to do, at least you have certain requirements you have to meet. You can say what you want, you can do what you want, but there are rules and regulations that keep you to say, you know, everybody go march on the Capitol and go burn down a building or whatever it might be. You can't do that if you own a radio station, if from the FCC rules and regulations.
Okay, well, we're
But you
going to
can
get
do
into
whatever you want.
We're going to get into the political implications in just a second, but Mr. Dunifer, is there any way you can operate these small radio outlets without interfering with other radio waves?
Yes, it's done every day. And what we really are seeking is some accommodation. We're not saying that everyone has just the right to go willy-nilly throw up a station, but it's kind of a forced situation because FCC does not have any procedure in place that allows for broadcast stations with 100 watts or less of power. You have to do a minimum 100 watts.
It's a very interesting question because today it's partly a technological question. On the one hand, micro radio is technically possible because people, very largely Steve Dunifer, have developed inexpensive ways of keeping the wavelength properly attuned, and short, doing with very inexpensive equipment what used to take a large amount of money for. So you can set up a micro station with a half watt, enough, let us say, to serve a housing project for something like $300, in short, for the cost of an ordinary television set. You can set up a station that'll serve the city of Berkeley for a couple of $1,000.
Well, the strength is one, is its immediacy. I mean, it's right there with people. Anyone can have, I mean, everyone owns a radio. I mean, there's no, as far as I can tell, real economic barrier that keeps a person from having access. And the entry of cost for setting up a station, I mean, using, you know, behind over here equipment we've designed, you know, a station covering up to 12 miles in radius, perhaps more depending on where the antenna is situated, can be put on the air for $1,500 or so dollars. I mean, that is in the range of any community, quite frankly, and we're looking at ways of reducing the cost, particularly at the low end, in the 6 to 15 watt range transmitters. We're redesigning to produce some what we call Model T units that could be easily mass-produced at a very low cost.
We broadcasted nearly continuously from February 95 to June of 98. At that time, the FCC approached someone in the Federal Aviation Administration and got someone at the FAA to complain about Free Radio Berkeley, saying that they are broadcasting on aircraft communication channels and could possibly lead to some, you know, plane falling out of the sky or some other aviation disaster. Now, whether this is true or not, we never saw any proof. But we did see copies of correspondence that went back and forth between the FCC and the FAA, where they sort of coached them what they wanted them to say.
How realistic is the worry of interference with airplane traffic, for instance?
Well, it's very realistic. I mean, we've had numerous complaints. When we acted against a pirate station that were interfering, it was because we heard from the FAA. They were very concerned that if a pilot is having his communication is being disrupted, you know, in an emergency, that could be a real problem. Or you could have a music or news or whatever it is, and a small airplane that's far out may not be able to get its signal to the tower to even know that they're out there. So there is no question, either they're off frequency or it's a spurious emission. I'm not an engineer and tell you about, you know, how the signals bounce, but engineers will say that. And talk to the FAA. To them, it is a very real problem. And when we hear about those cases, we move very, very quickly on those kind of cases. It does happen. It did happen.
It's silly. I mean, they'll come out. I mean, for example, we had one micro station in San Francisco that's still on the air, San Francisco Coalition Radio. Well, the FCC had to drive drive right on top of the station to get some little tiny spur signal that was supposedly in the FM, you know, in the aircraft band. I mean, and they claim this is some grave threat to, you know, air traffic. Well, the point is that when you analyzed their data and looked at the strength of the signal that they claim they found, well, the strength of the signal wasn't sufficient enough to go more than a couple of blocks. So the FCC basically has yet to really prove any solid case of any significant interference issues.
When the Lawyers Guild received their facts of the injunction, they notified Stephen. We had an emergency meeting about it. And then the group at large, FRB, had an emergency meeting. It went on for hours and hours, and we decided it would be in our interest to comply with the injunction and go off the air. So that's what we did in June of 1998.
Kind of like, this is my life, Free Radio Berkeley, these are my friends, when they shut us down the last time, that broke my heart. But, I restrained myself, and waited for the rest of the community to kind of wake up. And when they finally started waking up when they went after Pacifica Radio, and then they finally woke up, which was probably pretty good.
We have a big struggle in front of us. We have to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. Never.
Back in July of 1999, we had a crisis here in Berkeley because the local Pacifica network station, KPFA, suddenly locked out volunteers and fired some longtime volunteers and created a real crisis. And this led to huge demonstrations and people camping out in front of the station. And a group of us here in Berkeley, who were part of the Free Radio Berkeley collective, we decided it was time to do something. Free Radio Berkeley went off the air voluntarily in June of 1998 because of a federal injunction, and we decided, well, instead of fighting it and possibly losing all of our equipment through confiscation, we decided a better strategy would be to go off the air, regroup, and come back on at a later date. And so July of 1999, we felt the time had come, and there was a need to get some free speech happening on the airwaves.
A lot of it because it was
Sparked by the KPFA crisis, and so we